ask for compensation at these lectures, volunteer my time and energy for you guys. I do offer the book for sale, so here's my brief promo. There are roughly 250 color pages, color images of some of the greatest artworks in history. My lectures are built from material in the book. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the book on Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt. So if you like the style and content of the lecture, I think you'll love the book. Anyone that does buy it, I'd be happy to sign it, which would make it infinitely more valuable. And season, even for those of you who aren't collecting books at this time, it would make a great gift for that special person now that the holiday season is here. Best news of all, it's discounted here at $35, which is a great price for a hardback book with all those color images, and it's roughly the cost of an uninspired meal with a drink at Applebee's. So you can decide which is best for you. Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt were the only two women in the early Impressionistic movement. And they came from upper-class backgrounds, and they did not have to sell their art to support themselves. The subject of their matter, or the subject matter of their paintings, was similar: contemporary French bourgeois living. Both had famous mentors that I'll get into who importantly influenced their careers. Manet for Berthe, Degas for Mary. Both women faced a lot of hostility during their careers, trying to make their way in a male-dominated profession. The fact that they were impressionists, well, that added to their woes. So here are two brief quotes from that time. Came in the first Impressionistic exhibition in 1874. First one: 5 or 6 lunatics, one of whom is a woman, deranged by ambition. And secondly, there's also a woman in the group, as is the case with all famous gangs. In each case, the woman they were referring to was Berthe Morisot. This is a photo of Berthe. She was born in 1841, the same year as Renoir. In fact, she named Renoir as a guardian for her only child, Julie. And this photo is circa 1873, so she was about 32 years old at the time. Mary Cassatt was not the beauty that Berthe was. In fact, she once recalled her inability to please her stern father, who told her, "A girl's first duty is to be handsome, and her parents feel it when she isn't." Imagine that guy. Another difference was their personalities. Morisot was feminine, charming, sensuous. Cassatt, caustic and austere. Morisot was filled with doubts. Cassatt was more confident about exhibiting and selling her art. Morisot was helped by her husband. Cassatt had to help herself. Despite their differences, they became friends and exhibited together. There were 8 Impressionistic exhibitions from 1874 to 1886, and Berthe Morisot exhibited in 7 of them. The only one she missed was when she was having her daughter Julie. The fortune that Berthe inherited in 1873 resulted in the criticism that she was a woman that painted rather than a woman painter. And it was untrue. She was a committed artist. Along with Monet, Sisley, Pissarro, she was among the purest of the Impressionists. Hers could be considered among the most refined and delicate of the Impressionistic paintings. The world Berthe represented in her art was one of refinement, beautiful gardens, wonderful interiors, expensive clothing. A world almost exclusive to women represented in her social position in the fashionable bourgeoisie. Her paintings were different from male artists. There were no nudes, certainly no streetwalkers, or even entertainers. Boredom was one of her subjects because she understood it. Upper-class women had little to do in that era. She was in effect allowing viewers access to feminine activities and and their effects like clothing, flowers, jewelry. She started her training as a copyist at the Louvre, copying masters like Veronese and Rubens. At 20, she met Corot, a landscape and figurative painter from the Barbizon School. Under his influence, she took up plein air painting, and it was from Corot that she learned her calm, lazy effects. Berthe Morisot played two roles in the art world of that day. First, as a painter. But there was also another part of her life that attracts you to her, and that is as a muse for the art of Edouard Manet and her relations with him. In his 11 portraits of her, you get an idea of her beauty and her sensuality. But the portraits also reflect something about the mystery of their relationship, perhaps one of the greatest unfulfilled love stories in the history of art. She met Manet in 1878 at 27. It was difficult for women to move in male-dominated artist circles at that time. Although she had seen him in exhibits and knew his work, it was unacceptable for Berthe to introduce herself. So in accordance with etiquette, she had to wait until a mutual friend could introduce them. After all, Manet was married and Berthe was single first. There we go. This is Manet's Berthe Morisot Reclining, 1873. And here I think the element of seduction is unmistakable. There's her seductive gaze. Her dark eyes seem to follow the viewer around the room. Her reclining pose, I think, is indisputably provocative. There was a play about the lives of the Impressionists, and it was called Berthe Morisot Reclining. And in it, Degas calls Morisot's and Manet's relationship, quoting, the greatest relationship ever recorded on canvas. And after looking at this, maybe so. Second piece by Manet, Repose, 1870. And here she wears a white dress. There's a more pensive, dreamy aspect to her character. Her fingers of her left hand are spread between the white handkerchief and the star-shaped indentations of the sofa buttons. In her hand, she's holding a fan to emphasize her femininity, as if there's really a need to do that. Her black hair hangs below her shoulders. And does anyone have such a narrow waist? It's accentuated by the black sash. Her calm demeanor contrasts with the swirling brushstrokes of the portrait above her head. Obviously, this painting was carefully staged by Manet. Berthe told her daughter Julie that her left leg, drawn under her skirt, used to stiffen painfully, but Manet would not allow her to move, lest the skirt would become disarranged. Bunch of Violets, 1872. And this is possibly Manet's most intensely Spanish, most beautiful, powerful portrait of Berthe. What strikes you again is the intense black that could only be Manet's. There's the black hat, black scarf, black dress. A bunch of violets barely can be seen. It's nestled in the clasp of her jacket. She's posed against a plain gray curtain. The neutral background dramatizes the effect of the black and accentuates the aura of mystery in her faraway look. But it's Manet's depiction of her eyes where he works the most magic. He paints them deep, pure black. Forget that they were actually green. And look at some of the details and ribbons hanging down from her hat that accentuate the scattered strands of her hair. Her face is half in shadow, half in light. Later, her daughter Julie would say that Mama told me that during her sitting for one of these portraits, Manet told her she ought to marry Papa, who was his brother. And she did. After her marriage to his brother Eugene, Manet didn't paint any more portraits of her, and they burned each other's letters. If it was simply a platonic relationship, why didn't Manet continue to paint his sister-in-law after she married his brother? Did she marry Eugene because she couldn't marry Edouard? Is there any doubt that she would have married Manet if he hadn't already been married? Well, let me know when you have the answers, because I don't have. The sheer beauty and number of these portraits, I think, has aroused curiosity about the relations between the two. There's a charged connection between the artist and his beautiful subject. They're among his most moving works, possibly because of his fascination and emotional involvement with her. At the very least, Manet's portraits reveal not only the talent of the painter and the beauty of the model, but a bond between them. The relationship between Manet and Morisot was more than just about portraits. Although he could be considered the mentor and she the pupil, there was a reciprocity in the relationship. It was Berthe who drew Manet into the wider circle of the Impressionists. She encouraged him to abandon black, although that was never completely possible for him. She also convinced him to attempt plein air painting. And they even interacted in subject matters in some of their paintings. So here's an example. Next. This is Morisot's Summer. Next. And then Winter. So here, Morisot is painting women appropriately dressed for the season. And note those fairly short brushstrokes that can even be seen in the photo. And they're typically impressionistic. Next. And then Manet completes the series with autumn here and next. Spring. Manet's lines are sharper, less impressionistic, not better, just different. Next. The Cradle, 1872. And this is probably her most important piece, and received a favorable reception at the first Impressionistic exhibition in 1874, when some critics commented on its grace and elegance. She cast her lot with the Impressionists, partly because of their interest in genre paintings. Those are intimate scenes of ordinary people and everyday life. And this certainly qualifies as a genre painting. She liked to idealize motherhood, although at this point at least she had no children. And this was her first image of motherhood, which would be one of her favorite subjects. She also liked to use family and friends as models. So this is her delicate celebration of her sister Edna and her sleeping newborn baby Blanche. And the mother reflectively rests her chin on her hand. And there's an intensity in her gaze, and you can only guess what she's thinking. She also took note of current trends in nursery furniture. There's the diaphanous white neck, trimmed with a pink ribbon. The beautiful mother wears a black dress that's heightened by the white background. The infant is blurry featured in typical impressionistic manner. And Berthe's sensitivity to this subject matter, along with her attention to fashion, attracted a female following. But the painting never sold, and it stayed in the family until it was bought by the Louvre in 1930. Next. Mother and sister reading. And this is an example of the interaction between Morisot and Manet. But in this case, he went too far. She craved his admiration more than anything. But sometimes he could be arrogant and overbearing, much like we'll hear Degas was with Cassatt. On the occasion of this painting, Manet carried his domination too far. When Berthe completed the work, she asked Manet for his opinion. Instead of telling her what he would do or suggest, he took the brushes and began to retouch it and got carried away. And she described what occurred in a letter to her sister, Edna, quoting, "He came about 1 o'clock. He found it very good, except for the lower part of the dress. He took the brushes and put in a few accents that looked very well. And that's where our misfortunes began. Once started, nothing could stop him. From the skirt, he went to the bust, from the bust to the head, from the head to the background. He cracked 1,000 jokes, laughed like a madman, handed me the palette, and then took it back again. My mother thinks the episode is funny, but I find it agonizing. Next. Butterfly Hunt, 1874. And here she again using family and models as models. And this piece is also an example of how she focused on bourgeois women and their activities. This is her sister Edna and her children. So she's painting a world of women, children, fashion, pastime, all rolled up into one. Next. Summer's Day, 1879. And this is another one of her most important works. When you see it at the National Gallery in London, the figures almost dissolve into a flurry of feathery brushstrokes that pushes that impressionistic technique to the limit. In terms of subject matter, it's typically impressionistic in its depiction of modern urban leisure. We as the viewer occupy a seat opposite the two women, as though we've been invited to share in their enjoyment. Eugene Manet and his daughter at Bougival. So here we get a view of her husband with her daughter, who would have been near 3 at the time. Despite the whirling brushstrokes, look at the details. The garden's confined by a blue gate in the back, and alive with red flowers. Eugene gazes down at Julie, who rests her toy village on his knees. He's fashionably dressed, with a bowler hat, blue cravat, fawn-colored jacket, white or blue trousers. Julie has delicate features, long blonde hair and bangs, and she wears a yellow sunbonnet, tied with a ribbon under her neck, and a long pink frock, so fashion is everywhere here. Eugene observes her as she plays with the tiny pieces, and both seem to be absorbed in the game, and this is what you would expect from a father and his young daughter. Next. In the garden, in the background is Julie. The woman's tool here is her fan, not the rake behind her. That's probably for the gardener, because it's something she would never use. Not a bad life. Next. Dining room. Dining rooms and drawing rooms were different subjects from what men were painting, because women moved in different worlds. But it's still a modern impressionistic painting. It has the signature brushstrokes of the impression. It's all about the impression, or the feeling you get from the light spilling through the window. Next. Little girl with a doll, and this is Julie again. She was probably the most documented child in the history of art. Manet died in 1883 from complications after he had a leg amputated due to syphilis. Berthe Morisot was at his side when he died, and she wrote this to her sister. These last days were very painful. Poor Edouard suffered atrociously. His agony was horrible. In a word, it was death in the most appalling forms that I witnessed at very close range. If you add to these emotions my old bonds of friendship with Edouard, you will understand that I am crushed. I shall never forget the days of my friendship and intimacy with him, when I sat for him, and when the charm of his mind kept me alert, doing those long hours. Julie playing the violin, 1893. And this piece was painted 2 years before Berthe's death. Interestingly, she paid tribute to Manet by placing a copy of that portrait, Berthe Morisot reclining, that he had painted 20 years earlier in the background. It's in the far upper left corner. During her career, Berthe Morisot wanted to be treated as an equal. She said, quoting, "I don't think there has ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would ask. for I know I'm worth as much as they. But she lived in a time when equal treatment was rare. Even though she produced more than 860 paintings, her death certificate stated she had no profession. For a long time, she was known as much as being a friend and model for Manet than an artist in her own right. It took almost a century for work to receive the credit it deserved. Mary Cassatt's self-portrait, 1878, painted when she was 32 years old. Mary Cassatt lived a life of paradoxes. She was American-born, but lived and worked in France. She was a classically trained artist, but became involved, which was considered a group of radicals, the Impressionists. She never married, but became known for her paintings of mothers and children. Mary was one of the two women in the early Impressionistic movement, but the only American. She came from wealth. She was born near Pittsburgh and moved to the Westchester area. Her brother was chairman of the Pennsylvania Railroad. At 16, she enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, where she was a fellow student of Thomas Eakins. But not surprisingly, she found the male faculty and her fellow students patronizing and resentful of her attendance. Mary felt she couldn't be a great painter living in the U.S. After all, there were no major museums in the U.S. at that time. So she went to Europe, Spain first, and then Paris in 1866 at the age of 22, chaperoned, of course, by her mother. Like Berthe Morisot, she was a copier of old masters at the Louvre. When she saw Degas' pastels in a Paris gallery in 1877, she said, "They changed my life." They became lifelong friends, and she was the only woman Degas had a close relationship with. He became devoted to her, at least as much as Degas could become devoted to anyone. Although they were close, there was no suggestion that their relationship might have approached that of Berthe and Manet, even though both remained single throughout their lives. Mary was the perfect female counterpart to Degas in temperament. Both could be opinionated and abrasive. For example, although she admired Renoir's courage to paint late in life doing very ill health, she described his bather paintings as enormously fat red women with very small heads. She said Monet's water lily paintings looked like decorative wallpaper. Regarding the avant-garde movements of the early 20th century, she said, "No sound artist ever looked except for with scorn on those Cubists and Matisse." By the turn of the century, she resisted anything that was new. She couldn't understand Cézanne's growing reputation or influence. She condemned Monet's late work and strongly objected to the squalid, low-life subjects of Toulouse-Lautrec. And giving these impressions, her reaction when she went with a friend to the Paris apartment of Gertrude Stein to see her great collection of modern art, well, it should not be surprising. She said, quoting, "I have never in my life seen so many dreadful paintings in one place. I have never seen so many dreadful people gathered together. I want to be taken home at once." In 1877, her works were rejected by the Paris Salon, and Degas invited her to show with the Impressionists in 1879. And she participated in each of the last 4 Impressionistic exhibitions. Mary Cassatt's art falls roughly into 3 categories. From the 1870s to the mid-80s, under the influence of Degas and the Impressionists, she focused on female family members at tea or the opera and other movements. In 1889 and the early 90s, oils and pastels of mother and children became her favorite subject matter. And she also focused on making color prints in the spirit of Japanese woodblock prints. She returned to the U.S. in 1870, and her work attracted the attention of the Archbishop of Pittsburgh, who commissioned her to paint copies of paintings of the 16th century high Renaissance artist Correggio in Parma, Italy. The Bacchante, 1872. And this painting is nothing like what you will see later, but it's clearly influenced by Correggio and it recalls the art of ancient Rome. The Bacchante is a female follower of Bacchus, the Greek and Roman god of wine and drunken revelry. But Cassatt does not succumb to the temptation of the eroticism, often evident in Correggio's works. And there's an intensity in the woman's expression. Perhaps this is a stretch, but maybe the symbols held by the confident woman are an announcement to the art world that Mary Cassatt has arrived with a bang. When Cassatt took up residence in Paris in 1874, she abandoned this type of academic exercise in favor of scenes in modern life. Women attending social events like the opera or the ballet were a popular artistic theme at the time. But there was a distinct difference in how the subject was handled, depending on whether it was done from a woman's point of view, like Morisot or Cassatt, or from a man's perspective, like Renoir. So here's Renoir's L'Loge, 1874. In Renoir's version, the woman sits in the front of the box so she can be seen. Her social status is unclear, but given her showy black and white striped dress, her adornments, the heavy use of cosmetics, she's likely a courtesan, not the man's wife. In that era, some women were coquettes that were brought to the opera by their lovers. The woman lowers her opera glasses, revealing herself to all the potential admirers in the theater. And she's basically expressionless. Her passive demeanor has a purpose. She's signaling her availability and displaying her charms for all to see. Her bearded male companion, he ignores her. He sits behind her so he can use his glasses to survey the audience, perhaps looking for a new partner. So in a nutshell, it's about seeing and being seen. Renoir is providing us with a slice of the spectacle of modern life in the city at that time. Berthe Morisot's at the ball. She was probably aware of Renoir's L'Loge when she painted at the ball the following year. And she's making a contradictory statement because hers is from a woman's point of view. We see another beautiful woman in an evening gown wearing flowers, but with much less makeup. She has a dress that's more subtle, and the flowers are there not to draw attention to her. In fact, they seem to symbolize her innocence. She's beautiful, but presented as a thinking woman. Morisot is out to impress us with her world of delicate femininity. Next. And then there's Mary Cassatt's Woman with a Pearl Necklace in the Loge. And this is Mary Cassatt's sister, Lydia. And it's another painting about the culture of display in modern Paris. The stage here is not for the performers, the stage is the audience. They are on display. She leans slightly forward as though she's presenting herself to the audience that Cassatt clearly reveals through the mirror in the back of her. The luminous color and the fluid brushstrokes are synonymous with Impressionism. And there's a feminist element here. She's shown as intelligent, alone, probably self-sufficient. And there's no male escort. Notice the barely visible men in the first and second boxes on the right, focusing on her with binoculars. But she's not inviting anyone to join her. Cassatt's words about a year earlier are echoed in this painting. Oh, I'm independent, and I can live alone, and I love to work. But this lifestyle, unfortunately, did not adhere to the traditional ideas of the role of women near the end of the 19th century. Next. Degas danced with a bouquet of flowers. And Degas did it differently than either Berthe or Mary. He preferred to paint the dancers rather than the people watching them. The similarity is that there is a woman in a private theater box, and she's even holding a fan. But the difference is she's not the subject. The subject is the ballerina holding the flowers. Next. At the Opera, 1879. But Mary Cassatt did not always depict fashionably dressed beautiful women at these events. Perhaps paintings rather like this become a symbol of feminism. Here's a fiercely independent woman, unchaperoned, and attending the opera and taking on the male action of observing. There's no feminine softness here. There's even a masculinity in the way she holds the binoculars. She looks alone in the box, conveying independence. It's really the antithesis of the Renoir painting. Look carefully. There's a man in the background watching her. He leans over the ledge of the box with his binoculars glued to his eyes, but her posture seems to trivialize it. She's definitely not inviting anyone to join her. Little girl in a blue armchair, and I think this is one of her best pieces. It's a painting Degas advised her on, and even worked on the background. But a reaction to Degas' contribution was different from how Berthe Morisot reacted to Manet's interference in the piece that I described earlier. A more confident Cassatt was pleased rather than distressed by Degas' contribution. It shows Degas' influence in that the little girl is placed off-center. Also, the painting is cropped at the edge of the canvas to enhance the feel of an accidental image like you might get in photography. And these are all characteristics of Degas. The young girl with her legs dangling slumps in the overlarge chair. She's in her own private world of boredom. The girl's pose is all the naturalism of childhood. Cassatt wrote, "I love to paint children. They're so natural and truthful." And look at the details and emphasize the realism of the piece, even if it is impressionistic. Around her neck, around her waist is a tartan shawl that's echoed by the falling down socks and the ribbon in her hair. Daylight enters the room from two windows, and it casts a soft shadow that adds to the sense of the floor sort of inclines upward to the back of the room. She has the same self-satisfied expression as the dozing dog stretched out on the nearby chair. And I think all this makes this one of the great representations of a child in art. But it's also about modern life and new furniture. It's about fashion, and that everything matches. And when the painting was refused by the Paris Salon in 1878, Cassatt was furious, all the more so because Degas had worked on it. And that reaction helped propel her into the Impressionistic exhibitions the following year. Next. 5 o'clock tea. And this is another example of the world she had access to, the domestic and social life of well-off women. The painting is about the ritual of tea. There's a visitor and the host. One's finished and the other is still drinking. And note the difference in the clothes. One is dressed to go out with long yellow gloves and a hat, the obvious visitor. The other, there's a host without a hat. And the visitor with extended little fingers sips daintily from the blue-rimmed cup. The atmosphere is proper, fashionable, silent, stiff. Although the two women are sitting next to each other, there's no warmth here. It appears to be a tedious social ritual. But the painting is also about the meticulously decorated interior. There's a richly furnished drawing room with striped wallpaper and a chintz sofa. A bell rope for summering servants fades into the stripes. There's a gleaming silver tea service with light reflecting off it in the gilt mirror and marble fireplace. Not everything went smoothly in the relationship between Cassatt and Degas. For example, regarding his critique of her work, she said, quoting, "I've been half a dozen times to the point of asking Degas to come and see my work, but if he happens to be in the mood, he would demolish me so completely that I could never pick myself up in time to finish for the exhibition." In 1874, he pushed things too far. When Degas did a portrait of Mary, in her opinion, he degraded her. Next. So let's go back to the beginning, and this is the same self-portrait, Cassatt self-portrait, 1878. We saw this at the start of the discussion. She portrays herself in dangling earrings, a ruffled white gown, white gloves. Her hat is trimmed with red flowers. Tied in the back with a ribbon around her neck, she leans on a soft, red striped chair and looks away. Next. Then Degas' portrait of Mary Cassatt, 6 years later, and looking much older, with a black dress instead of the ruffled white gown. She's sitting on a hard chair, leaning forward with elbows on the knees, in an unflattering, hunched forward position, holding 3 cards, and looking down at them, suggesting, at least in her opinion, a gypsy fortune teller. She was ashamed and revolted by the portrait. Later, in letters to her agent, she insisted, quoting, "I do not want to leave it with my family as being of me. It represents me as such a repugnant person that I would not want it known that I posed for it." To avoid the painting being recognized as her portrait, she wanted it sold to a foreigner without her name on it. Well, it just didn't happen. Of all places, it ends up in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. So consider the difference between Degas' approach and Manet's passionate portraits that we saw of Berthe Morisot. They express his deep feeling and attraction to her. In contrast, Degas' cool portrait of Mary Cassatt, I think, reveals the constraints in their relationship. Helen Septinel, 1890. In the 90s, Mary Cassatt adopted the mother and child theme. And this is a great example. Look at the marvelous way she paints the pressing of the woman's cheek against the cheek of the child. The infant shares a tender moment with the adoring mother. In paintings like this, I think she was able to document the intimacy of private moments of women in ways that male artists never could. In short, she had a competitive advantage here. Next. The caress. Here's a richly dressed woman who has the air of a Renaissance noblewoman, seated on a velvet chair and dressed in the type of velvet that Renaissance masters like Titian or Veronese loved to paint. Next. Patty cake. Another great example of the mother and child theme. And notice, the fathers seem to play no part in their families. They're always absent from these paintings. Next. Young Thomas and his mother. Final example of the mother and child theme. It's a pastel that Mary, influenced by Degas, was very proficient at. It's an intensely intimate scene. The mother props the child on the couch, perhaps after a nap, and he's preoccupied with her necklace. It's as if the mother's sort of lovingly sniffing at his tender arm. Next. 2 paintings, this first one by Morisot, The Cherry Tree. Next. And then Mary Cassatt's Young Women Picking the Fruit of Knowledge, both painted in the same year, 1892. And these paintings provide a direct comparison of the styles of Berthe and Mary. As I said, they were painted the same year. Morisot's piece was a pure impressionistic technique with loose feathery brushstrokes. Her coloring is more delicate and subtle. Cassatt's painting here is more hard-edged and linear in style than even most of her works. Most important, it's highly symbolic and feminist charged. According to Mary Cassatt, the pear tree shown here represents the tree of knowledge. One of the women holds a pear in her lap. In plucking the fruit from the tree of knowledge, women expressed their desire for equality and intellectual recognition. Perhaps the greatest similarity between the two artists was that they were both criticized for the repetition of the so-called monotony of the subject matter. Domestic interiors, tea, gardens, clothes, mothers, children. But remember, this came always from male critics. Their subject matter was because of the limited aspects or access to the aspects of society that men had. Cities, taverns, news. In short, women's lives were different from men. In 1892, she was commissioned to do a huge mural, 12 by 58 feet, for the Women's Building at the Chicago World's Exhibition in 1893. The goal was to showcase the advancement of women throughout history. The mural was titled Modern Woman, and she took the fruit-picking theme we just saw for the center panel. So let's look at that center panel, which is a better view of that particular scene. Go back. The left panel shows three girls pursuing fame, who is shown by a female figure, flying female figure in the upper right. The geese in the lower left represent society, quacking its disapproval of such unconventional aspirations. And the right panel shows three young women engaged in the arts, music, dancing. Unfortunately, the mural didn't survive. It was lost when the building was destroyed. Lydia crocheting in the Garden of Marley. And the first thing you notice here are the glorious colors, the beautiful blue dress, the contrasting white hat to shield her from the sun, the greenery, the violet plants. But this is one of Mary's most difficult and moving projects. She was very close to her sister Lydia, and she was a frequent model. Just a year earlier, she had painted her at her peak, a beautiful woman at the opera. Remember that piece? But she contracted a devastating disease. Now he was painting her in decline, and Lydia, who died 2 years later. Next. The Letter, 1891. Mary Cassatt became attracted to Japanese prints after seeing them at a show in Paris in 1890. She became entranced with the themes of everyday activities and the simple beauty. Japanese woodblock prints date to the 8th century and became very popular in France in the second half of the 19th century. And this piece has many of the characteristics of a Japanese print. They often depict everyday life activities of commoners. There's a flatness with the figures in the foreground placed against decorative patterns in the background. So here Cassatt takes the daily mundane activity of licking an envelope and aligns it with a Japanese-inspired composition and design. At first glance, you might wonder why Cassatt would paint a subject that seems like such a trivial activity. But remember that in her time, letter writing consumed a large part of the woman's day. And this is one of her most popular and frequently reproduced works. It also has many of the characteristics of Japanese prints. The colors are delicate, there's a contrasting decorative patterns of the wallpaper and the design on the dress. There's a direct frontal position of the figure and a flat space. And the female even looks faintly Japanese in her features and skin tones. And her downward gaze recalls Japanese modesty. Turtle Caress. And this is a poignant piece that shows her accomplishments in printmaking. It has been described as one of her pearls of oriental sweetness because it combines the themes of mother and child in Japanese prints. The images conjure an intimacy reminiscent of Renaissance paintings of the Madonna and Child. And it's amazing, to me at least, that such a touching image of eternity could be created by a woman who remained childless all her life. Edgar Degas died in 1917 at the age of 83. Mary Cassatt's reaction to his death was different from that of Berthe Morisot on the death of Manet. As I read earlier, Berthe's letter to her sister was personal and emotional. It emphasized his charm and her crushing loss. Cassatt's response was cooler. She mourned him as a friend and a brilliant artist whose passing signaled the end of the era. She wrote, quoting, "Degas died at midnight. His death is a deliverance. I am sad since he was my oldest friend here and the last great artist of the 20th century. I see no one to replace him." Mary Cassatt died in 1926 at 82. She lived in France for 55 years and made only 3 trips back to America, partly because traveling by sea made her ill. As she aged, she endured serious eye problems. By 1919, she had had 5 cataract operations. Thus, she shared a tragic bond with a man she was friends with for a large part of her life, Edgar Degas. Both died nearly totally blind. Neither was able to produce any new paintings over the last decade of their lives. It must have been very difficult for them. In addition to art, Mary Cassatt played another important role in the Impressionistic movement. She was instrumental in promoting the works of the Impressionists in the U.S., again through her brother, Alexander, who was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. She persuaded him to buy works by Manet, Monet, Morisot, Renoir, Pissarro, making him the first important Impressionistic collector in the U.S. She also encouraged her friends to buy. So let me conclude with some personal observations. Because Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt were the only prominent women painters of the day, and because they worked in a field dominated by men, let me try to explore how accomplished their art really was and where they might rank in the artists of that era. On occasion, some writers have suggested the lack of women artists of that era resulted from their lack of ability. And Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt fall into that category. Some said their wealth and the desire of the Impressionistic movement to emphasize the modern roots by including women were responsible for their acceptance and success. Mary Cassatt, in particular, has been criticized because her mother and child theme were closely associated with women, and hence thought to be not very original. I don't think those criticisms apply. The obstacles these 2 women faced, working in a male profession in the late 19th century, must have been enormous. One perspective at the time was the greatest contributions to the world of art that could be made by any woman was to be the mother of an artistic genius. They must have been exceptional, almost superhuman, to overcome the obstacles. They were both anomalies and had to be very talented. Here's a quote from that period, quoting, "No respectable or fine lady could be a professional artist. Ladies were permitted to paint roses or pansies on china plates, even make pencil sketches or watercolors in their enclosed gardens. But to study art seriously, learning anatomy from nude models, having a studio of their own, it was never done and therefore unthinkable." Having said all that, even though I think today biases against women artists have fallen a long way, history still has not elevated either one to the level of the most prestigious painters of that era. Their accomplishments do not match those of the so-called masters. But perhaps that's starting to change. In June of 2013, Berthe Morisot's portrait, After Lunch, sold at Christie's auction for $11 million, a record for an artist, a female artist, a record for that artist, and at the time, a record for a female artist. And this is it, Morisot's After Lunch. And even in this photograph, you can see the feathery, impressionistic brushstrokes. So you're left with a pecking order, as is usually the case. Again, I don't think it's based on any bias against women artists today. Essentially, Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt rank in the second tier, and that isn't bad. They're below the masters like Renoir, Monet, Degas, and they vie for prominence with names like Sicily and Pissarro. And Cassatt was good enough to be awarded the Legion of Honor by France in 1904. And as far as American women artists are concerned, Mary Cassatt is among the most distinguished. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll partake of the book.